Welcome to the first lecture for Chapter 3, Communication and the Self. In this lecture, we are going to be talking about what is the self-concept, so just kind of understanding this concept. And in the next lecture, we'll really talk about how we communicate ideas and images of ourselves to others through self-disclosure. So what is the self-concept? Your chapter defines self-concept in a number of ways. The first definition that they provide is the self-concept being composed of stable ideas about who you are as a person. So another word that we could use to identify this concept is identity. So really thinking about what is your identity? How do you kind of describe yourself? How do you define yourself? And so thinking about this in a number of different ways. The first kind of way that we can categorize or think about the self-concept or identity, or how we think about who we are, is through physical or social categories. So whether you are, we've talked about sex and gender, so whether you're a male or a female, whether you're tall or short, kind of thinking about social categories, like you're a Bloomsburg University student, you're a university student. You can think about like junior, senior, the differences between those different categories. So really thinking about some of the social categories that you belong to, and linking that back to some of the things that we talked about in terms of the co-cultures that you are a part of and how those influence your self-concept and your identity. The second way that we can define ourselves is through our skills or interests. So thinking about, certain skill set, maybe you're an athlete, maybe you're really good at cooking, maybe you play a musical instrument. We can think about our interests, maybe you're really interested in the outdoors or crafting. So these are some different ways that we, outside of kind of like our physical attributes and our social categories, that we can use to understand who we are as a person, or what makes up our identity. And third, and finally, we define ourselves by our relationships to other people. And, we have lots of terms to represent this category. So all of you are either, sons or daughters, you may be sisters or brothers, you could be aunts or uncles, you may be a romantic partner. So thinking about the relationships that you have with other people help define who you are as a person. They really make up pieces of your identity. And so when we think about the definition of self-concept that's represented in your chapter, there are some characteristics of self-concept that were identified. And the first is that self-concepts are multifaceted. So in this vein, our self-concept is essentially a collection of our smaller selves. And really, when we think about those three categories that I just discussed, physical or social categories, skills and interests, and relationships to other people, you probably have multiple things under each of those three categories. And so that's really representing this multifaceted aspect of our identity. We aren't just one thing. We are a lot of many different things. And so then this way we have kind of these mini selves or smaller selves that collect and are put together to create our identity. And so there are multiple levels of the ways that we define ourselves to others. And that essentially is the first category of being multifaceted. Another way that your chapter talked about this concept of concepts or identities being multifaceted is through the Johari window. And so as we think about the Johari window, this is really a visual representation of the collection of selves that I just talked about. And so really, thinking about categorizing this in a similar but different way. And in the Johari window, there are 4 window panes that are made up of the interaction between 2 really important dimensions. In these 2 dimensions, the first is aspects of our self-concept that are known to us. So essentially just things that we know about ourselves, and aspects of our self-concept that are known to others, either information that we voluntarily provide or that they kind of deduce or observe on their own. And so these 2 aspects of our self-concept, the information that is known to us and the pieces of our self-concept that are known to others, they interact to create these 4 window panes. And so you can see here in this visualization, in the first, the green panel, we have the known self. And so the known self is essentially things that we know about ourselves, but that others also know about us. So this is, pretty basic information that we may share. When we think about those categories, many of our physical attributes, whether we're tall or we're short, the color of our skin, all of those things are very visible when you first meet somebody before you even say anything. And it's information that we know about ourselves, and it's information that others know about us, either because they can see it and observe it, or because we tell them. And so when we think more about those social categories or the skills and interests, we know that, you may tell somebody, oh, I'm a really good cook, I really like to bake, and so then that information would be put into the known self. I know that about myself, and now I've shared it, and so others know it about me too. If we look at the left blue, so the light blue box, information that is known to us but not known to others is categorized under the hidden self. So really thinking about, there's information that we may hold private. We may not share that information with others until we get to know them a little bit better. And we'll talk more about that when we talk in the next lecture about self-disclosure, revealing pieces of the hidden self that would then become the known self through self-disclosure. But in terms of understanding our self-concept, there's information about ourselves that we know to be true, but we may not want to share with others when we first meet them, or even when we're in a close relationship with them. And so all of those things would be categorized under this idea of the hidden self. If we go up to the top right-hand corner to the blind self, there's information that is known to others, or that but may not be thought true by ourselves, or not known to us. So this would be the kinds of information that maybe others perceive about you fairly accurately, but you don't necessarily believe it to be true about yourself. And so you may not put that into your own self-concept as readily. So, when I think about, some people identify pieces of the blind self when they ask their friends and family, kind of how would you define me, or what do you think of me? And, somebody may be like, well, you're really bossy. And I'm like, what? I'm not bossy. And so that would be maybe you actually are bossy in how you interact with other people. And so some of that information would be under this blind self, information that others know to be true about you. They've observed it through interactions with you, but you maybe don't see that part of yourself. And we'll talk about that a little bit in the idea that your self-concept is subjective. And so that's kind of where we get the subjectivity, is really get this idea of the blind self. And then finally, we have the unknown self, or the unknown area. So thinking about things that really aren't known to yourself yet and not known to others. And I really like this box here in the bottom right-hand corner, the other blue box, because I think, when we think about the development of the self-concept, there are things that we may not have discovered to be true about our identities and what our likes and dislikes are. And, especially as we mature, through adolescence and emerging adulthood, where many of you may be at this current point, you have a lot of exploration to do. And so I like this because the unknown self really represents that to be determined aspect of our self-concept, which I think is really cool when thinking about how we develop as people, and especially thinking about how relationships can influence our self-concept and our development. So as we think about the definition and characteristics of a self-concept a little bit further, I hinted at the second characteristic, which is that self-concepts are partly subjective. And so as we think about especially that blind self box, there are aspects of ourselves that are based on our impressions rather than objective facts. And these kind of impressions of how we behave and how we think about ourselves, how we judge ourselves, may be in line with the objective facts or not. And so thinking about some of that blind self, in the Johari window, it's really difficult to judge ourselves accurately, and sometimes we can perceive ourselves as being overly negative or overly positive depending on the situation. In either way, we don't always have this kind of accurate representation of our own behaviors, and so falls into that blind self area where, if our impressions, kind of our self judgments, don't necessarily match up with some of our behaviors and our personality characteristics, then we may have information that other people know through our interactions to be true, but maybe we haven't perceived about ourselves yet, because it's really hard to accurately judge ourselves because of this subjectivity. The second, or the third, pardon me, characteristic is that self-concepts are rather enduring, but they can change. And so when we think about, and we'll talk in just a moment, the development of self-concepts, we know that self-concepts generally develop slowly over time, and they're rather not easily changed. There's where we get that enduring part, but there are some times in life where our self-concepts are rapidly growing and changing. And so I talked a little bit about some of the developmental periods. So things like adolescence and emerging adulthood are really times in our growth and development as humans that we are learning a lot about ourselves, and we're experiencing many new things. And so in that way, our self-concept is changing pretty quickly in a small period of time in relation to our overall lifespan. So that would be one exception to this kind of rule of an endurance in terms of our self-concept. During adolescence and emerging adulthood, when we're having lots of new experiences, our cognitive and physical development is rapidly changing. We are having a lot of change in our self-concept. The second kind of exception to this enduring characteristic is when we experience significant life events. And so there are many significant life events that we may experience, maybe the divorce of our parents, maybe a difficult breakup. I study cancer patients and communication among cancer patients and their partners. And cancer patients talk a lot about that cancer experience as being a major life-altering event that sometimes changes aspects of their identity and their self-concept. And so that would be an example of when a significant life event may change that image of ourselves that is otherwise rather enduring. So as we think about self-concepts and how they develop, we know that personality and biology really play into this quite a bit. Thinking about personality as being the pattern of distinct ways that we tend to think about and act across situations. And so there are pieces of our biology that influence our personality, but also thinking about kind of that nature versus nurture argument, there are also pieces of our environment that would influence our personality. And so as we think about also just kind of biology separately, that physical aspect of our self-concept really influenced by kind of our genetics, determining how tall you are, how much you weigh, what your skin color is, and things of that nature. We've talked a lot already about culture and gender roles, and these pieces are really important from chapter 2 in influencing our self-concept and our identity. So thinking about the influence of culture and what it kind of means to be masculine or feminine or androgynous, what it means to be kind of high or low context. So all of those individualism versus collectivism, all of those pieces that we've talked about in chapter 2 really having an important role on how our identity is kind of manifests or develops. Our self-concepts are also developed through the process, the larger process of reflected appraisal. And reflected appraisal is essentially this idea that we come to think about ourselves and see ourselves in a certain way because of our interactions with other people. So we tend to view ourselves as others see us and communicate to us. So when we think about I have a son, and I think about a lot in terms of how I communicate to him. If I can't constantly am telling him, you're so smart, you're so smart, you're so smart, that communication about that aspect of his self-concept is going to eventually potentially be reflected in how he views himself as being smart. Similarly, if I say you're really good at sports, or you're really kind, or you're a bad boy, and so we think about this sometimes in our negative communication with him. How do we discipline him? Do we talk about really focusing on the behavior as opposed to some personality trait? All of this is a tangent to really representing how people talk about our identity is reflected in how we view ourselves. And so really thinking about that as being an important facet of how our self-concepts develop. And finally, self-concepts are largely influenced in part by social comparison. So, especially thinking about, adolescent years, teenage years, emerging adult years, you are spending a lot of time with your peers, and you may engage in this idea of social comparison. So, comparing, your overall, you think about just physical appearance based on other people who are your same age, kind of same socioeconomic status, and does that mean that you're good looking or bad looking? And so making the social comparison. I see this a lot in classes in terms of performance in class. So, sometimes I'll hand back that first exam, and I, have students who will turn to their neighbors and their friends and say, what'd you get on the exam, or what'd you get? And they'll compare their scores, right? And that is really important because students are trying to get a sense of what their score means in terms of the larger class performance. And so thinking about, if we have a student who scored an 85 and he turned, 85 pretty above average grade, right? And I say, the class average was a 92. That 85 score is not looking that great anymore because it's well below the class average. But if I say that you got, so that student in comparison to the scores in the rest of the class would think that they did not do well in the exam, even though 85 is generally considered a good score. Now, if I said that you got a 85 and the class average was 62, the student is going to think, wow, I did excellent. I am well above the class average. I performed beautifully, even though maybe they didn't get an A score. And so this is a, kind of a example of how social comparison is used to kind of judge how good or bad pieces of ourselves are. And this really goes over time. These social comparisons are really important in influencing our self-concept in potentially good and also potentially troubling ways. The next thing that we're going to talk about, and this will bleed into some of what we will discuss in the next lecture, is our overall awareness and management and communication of the self. And so first looking at the awareness of the self. Self-monitoring was discussed in your book, in this chapter 3, and self-monitoring is essentially an individual's awareness of how he or she looks and sounds, and of how that person's behavior is affecting others. So essentially this is an awareness of your own kind of communication, your own behaviors, your own presence, and how that presence is being perceived by other people, and your ability to maybe change that behavior based on those responses. And so I really like self-monitoring because I think high self-monitors, people who do this really well, who are able to kind of monitor other people's reactions to their behavior and to what they say, they're really attuning to the feedback channel component of those models of communication. And not only are they just aware of the feedback, but they're using that feedback to kind of better their performance per se. And so we know through research that studies self-monitoring that high self-monitors are better at this idea of impression management, so kind of managing how other people see you. Because they are better at impression management, they are oftentimes rated as being more socially competent. But high self-monitors also have a hard time relaxing, kind of living in the moment, not caring what other people think. And so this can lead into some potential kind of mental health issues. So if we're constantly engaging in that social comparison, constantly worried about what other people are thinking about us, where is the kind of line? Where's the Zen moment? And so that's just something to think about in terms of this behavior. Second thing that we'll talk about in this lecture in terms of awareness and kind of management of the self is the self-fulfilling prophecy. And essentially this is a situation in which a prediction causes people to act and communicate in ways that make that prediction come true. And so essentially we think a certain way about something, we're maybe primed about that issue or that person. Thus that priming prompts us to communicate in a certain way, which then creates an interaction that confirms our assumptions. And this is kind of a fuzzy, abstract concept. So let's put it into an example. So if I'm going into an interaction where I'm maybe meeting somebody for the first time, and maybe it's a friend of a friend, and my friend goes, oh, this is Nancy. We're going to go meet Nancy, and Nancy is just kind of like standoffish. She doesn't really like new people, so don't worry if she doesn't talk a lot much. So I go into this interaction, I meet Nancy. Hi, Nancy, it's nice to meet you. Maybe she doesn't say much, and so because of that priming, I don't try to encourage that interaction anymore. Maybe I'm even like kind of ignore and more standoffish than I would normally be. And I leave that interaction being like, well, yeah, Nancy, kind of is a dull dud. But and when we think about this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy, if we hadn't had that priming, I may have acted in a different way. I may have tried to engage more with Nancy, which may have brought Nancy out of her shell, or maybe just prompted Nancy to act in a different way. And so thinking about this as being really important in terms of our interactions with others, in the information that we have about those people and their self-concept, before we engage in those interactions. The last thing that we, and a really big part of the self-concept, such a big part that we're going to break it down and talk a lot more about it in the next lecture, is self-disclosure. And so self-disclosure is really how we communicate information about ourselves to others. And so that is where we will start in the second lecture for Chapter 3. In the meantime, go to the individual assignments folder. Before you do the next lecture in the series, I ask that you complete the 36 questions assignment, which is the individual assignment for this chapter. We'll be using that assignment in our discussion in interacting with your classmates through the discussion feature and Play Pause It in the second lecture for this chapter.